Hello, my name is Phil. I'm the Director of the Draycott and Lem Valley Benefice, and this is my Sunday sermon for the 28th of June 2026. I'm not wearing a collar because I'm recording this in the middle of a heat wave and after 5 years and however many videos. Hopefully, you all believe me now that I have in fact been ordained. So, our reading for today comes from Psalm 13. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. Could be a heretic, but I think the Kinks were loads better than the Beatles. But let's be honest, neither of them are really the place to go for life advice. Given we're in the middle of a heat wave, here are some lyrics from Sunny Afternoon by the Kinks. The taxman's taken all my dough and left me in my stately home, lazing on a sunny afternoon. And I can't sail my yacht. He's taken everything I've got, all I've got this sunny afternoon. Save me, save me, save me from this squeeze. My girlfriend's run off with my car and gone back to her ma and pa, telling tales of drunkenness and cruelty. Now I'm sitting here, sipping at my ice-cold beer, lazing on a sunny afternoon. Help me, help me, help me, help me sail away. Got a man in this song, haven't we, whose life has completely fallen apart. He's facing destitution as a result of a massive unpaid tax bill. His girlfriend has walked out on him back to her parents, and worst of all, he can't even sail his yacht anymore. And what's his response? His response is to pour himself a cold beer, sit in the sun, and pretend that none of it is actually happening. Now, to be fair to the Kinks, I think this is actually a caricature. It's a satire rather than a genuine suggestion for how they think you should respond to life's troubles. But the core philosophy at the heart of this song, and that temptation to stick your head in the sand when disaster strikes, is actually an incredibly attractive idea. We see this happening all around us now. The latest data from Reuters shows that a staggering 50% of people in the UK now sometimes or often actively avoid checking the news altogether because it's too depressing, too relentless. The ostrich approach of sticking our heads in the sand and sipping beer while the world burns is a highly popular modern coping mechanism. But it's radically different to the approach that we find in our Bible reading today. Psalm 13 is a classic psalm of lament. It belongs to a specific group of psalms designed to be sung when a nation or individual is walking through immense trauma and suffering. The psalm doesn't come with a neat date stamp, so we don't know exactly when it was written, but it is labelled as a psalm of David. And when you look at the raw content, it points to a period of long, drawn-out fear, giving us a vivid window into what David might actually have been experiencing at the time of writing this psalm. For about 10 years, David lived as a fugitive, hiding from King Saul in the brutal Judean desert. He was sleeping in caves, completely cut off from his family and friends, constantly trying to dodge an entire national army that was set to hunt him down and kill him. That kind of survival mode forces you into a deep, painful isolation. It leaves you entirely stuck in your head, which is exactly how David describes it in verse 2. And when you spend a decade on the run, you start to understand why he cries out, "How long?" 4 times in the first 2 verses. Ultimately, whether David penned those words from a dark cave or during a different crisis, this raw, unfiltered prayer of a man in the trenches, is what it is. He is fearing for his life, exhausted by a relentless campaign, and feeling like God has gone completely AWOL. And I'm sure most of us are unlikely to find ourselves on the run in a desert for 10 years. But I'm absolutely certain that all of us can relate to that "how long" cry. Maybe there's a situation that's been going on in your life for years, something you've been praying about desperately, but the answer hasn't come about yet. Or perhaps there's not one single headline crisis, but rather an exhausting sense of one thing after another. Life just keeps throwing punches at you, and you're asking God, when will the hits stop, just long enough for you to simply catch your breath? If you can relate to that, then our reading for today is an incredibly liberating psalm for us, because David's journey out of the caves shows us three freeing truths that stand in this psalm in a complete contrast to the Sunday afternoon approach of the man in the King's song. So firstly, I think what this psalm tells us is that faith leaves room for raw honesty. I think potentially this is quite difficult for us as British people, because we're so culturally conditioned into that mustn't grumble, stiff upper lip outlook on life. I don't know if you can relate to this, but I'm so deeply programmed into that mustn't grumble mindset that even when I go to see the doctor because I'm ill, when he asks me how I am, my knee-jerk reaction is to say, "I'm fine, thank you, how are you?" We reflexively mask our pain to be polite. But this is not a problem that David has in our psalm. Listen to verse 2. "How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart?" David doesn't hold back. He isn't polite. He tells God exactly how it is. And maybe that's the exact permission that some of us need to have today. The psalm tells us that it's entirely okay to look at your life and say to God, "I'm not happy with the way things are right now." That's not heretical. That's not sacrilege. It's following the exact model for interacting with God that's laid out in the Bible. Nowhere in the Bible does God tell his followers that they need to sanitize or mitigate their emotions before they can come into his presence. Yes, you have books like Proverbs, which highly recommend sleeping on things and calming down before you start an argument with other people. But the Bible is clear that you don't have to put on a performance before God. He wants you to come before him exactly as you are and lay it all bare. The great Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon once said about Scripture something that applies to our prayers. He famously said, "You don't defend a lion, you just open the cage and let it roar." That's true of Scripture, but actually it's the same as God. God is the all-powerful creator of everything. You don't need to protect his feelings when you pray. Realizing that God is big enough to handle your raw, unedited anger, grief, exhaustion, or whatever isn't a lack of faith. It's actually an act of deep worship. It proves you know that he is far too big to be fragile and far too loving to be offended by your honesty. So this psalm tells us that there is room for raw honesty before God. It also tells us that despair loses its grip when we turn it into prayer. Notice that while David is completely open with God about his anguish, crying out, "How long?" 4 times, he doesn't just stay there. He doesn't let this lament turn into a permanent kind of woe to me pity party. Instead, he turns his anguish into a petition. In verse 3, his language shifts from complaint about God to a direct, specific request of God. He prays, "Look on me and answer. Lord my God, give light to my eyes." That phrase, give light to my eyes, was a very specific phrase with a specific meaning in ancient Hebrew. It means to restore vitality, hope, and physical strength to someone who is completely spent. David is effectively saying, Lord, I'm running on empty. I've got absolutely nothing left. If you don't revive me now, I'm not going to make it. This psalm isn't just a raw, honest rant. David shifts his energy away from the rawness of his problems to make a bold request of God. And once again, this is something that maybe we British people deeply struggle with. We're simply not good at asking for things directly. Have you ever noticed that in polite society, when there's only one piece of cake left on the plate, the correct etiquette is to look around and to say, would anybody else like the last piece of cake? But what that phrase actually means is, I want the last piece of cake. We often wrap our desires in a layer of polite hesitation. But unfortunately, we often carry in that same attitude of polite hesitation into our prayer lives. And it makes prayer so much harder than it needs to be. Another liberating truth from this psalm is that it's entirely okay to boldly ask God to look at you, to answer you, and to help you. Sometimes we can slip into a kind of toxic theology where God is so big and so mighty and so powerful that we shouldn't ever bother him with our tiny, insignificant lives. We think we have to grovel or stand at a polite distance. But the entire point of the Christian gospel is that the infinite God became a human being in Jesus Christ to live amongst us, to die for us, and to open the door so that we could come before him with absolute boldness and confidence. David doesn't shrink back because God is big. He runs directly to him because he knew his Father could handle the request. Which takes us quite neatly into our final liberating truth. Our ultimate joy is anchored in who God is, not what we are going through. Up until this point, David has laid everything on the table. He's told God how awful everything is. He's asked for the specific help that he needs. But then, in the final 2 verses of the psalm, his perspective radically changes. Having looked inwards at what he feels and outwards at what he needs, his focus now switches upwards entirely to who God is. He writes, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. Notice where his mind goes. The focus is no longer on King Saul or the desert or his own racing thoughts. His focus is now on God's unfailing love, a love that holds fast even when life falls apart. He focuses on the fact that God is the bringer of salvation, that God is worthy of praise, and crucially, he remembers that God has been good to him in the past. This memory of God's track record becomes his anchor. It is the steady confidence that allows him to weather the current storm. And I wonder if these final 2 verses are closer to how you might originally expect the Bible to tell us to pray. If we're honest, I think verses 5 and 6 perhaps feel a little bit holier and a better way to pray when we hit trouble compared to the first 4 verses. We think we're supposed to immediately jump into the praise part. And certainly anchoring ourselves in God's goodness is exactly where we need to get up to. But here's the profound beauty of this psalm. David had to go through the other 2 stages before he could get there. He didn't bypass the pain, he processed it. He didn't put on a fake smile, he wrestled his way through the petition to the worship. Sometimes God's goodness and his power can become even more striking, even more breathtaking when they're contrasted against our troubles. When we allow ourselves to be completely honest about our pain, it actually creates the space for God to show up. And when we finally lift our eyes to see him, we realize that whilst our problems are real, God is infinitely bigger, which makes the problems smaller. So as I come in to land today, a confession. It's been incredibly hot this week. And to be honest, after I've done this, sitting out in the garden with a nice cold beer is very much on my agenda. But when I sit out there later today, I'll be reminded of this beautiful truth. God will be right there in the garden with me. And he won't be there as a distant, rigid judge checking to see if I'm behaving. He'll be there as a loving father and faithful friend. He cares about me and he cares about you. And he loves us so deeply that we never have to put on a performance for him. You don't have to hide behind that polite British filter when life is falling apart. You don't have to pretend you're fine when you're actually running on empty. Whatever cave you might find yourself in today, and however long you've been crying out for change, remember that you can lay it all before him. Bring him your raw honesty. Bring him your bold requests. And as you pour out your heart to him, trust that he's big enough to hold you, loving enough to listen, and faithful enough to light up your eyes once again.